Imagine a lone man without weapons, not physically present on the battlefield, shaping the fate of one of history's greatest battles solely through the power of words, his own imagination, and clever deceptions. He not only managed to mislead Hitler and the Nazi commanders, but also with an imaginary network of spies, caused thousands of German soldiers to be stationed in the wrong places. This man, Joan Pujol Garcia, known as Garbo, was a Spanish spy who received both the Nazi Iron Cross and the Order of the British Empire. To help you better understand, imagine that during the Iran-Iraq War, someone received a Medal of Courage from Saddam Hussein and also the Fath Medal from Ayatollah Khomeini. It's almost impossible to receive a top bravery medal from two potential enemies at the same time, but Garbo managed to do just that. Greetings to you all. I'm Ilyas Farooq. This is Persian Trend. And in this video, we're going to get to know a man who was rejected 3 times by the British for recruitment into their spy network, and eventually sold himself to the Germans. Well, not himself exactly, he sold his story to the Germans, and that led to Britain's victory. This true story from World War II is so fascinating that you'll realize in the world of espionage, nothing is ever as it seems, and reality can be a complete 180 degrees different from what is reported. If you want to know how one man changed history with his iron will, watch this video to the end. Juan Garcia was born on February 14, 1912 in Barcelona, Spain. He was the third of 4 children in a wealthy family. His father, Joan Pujol, owned a cotton factory in Catalonia, and his mother, Mercedes Garcia, was a religious woman from Granada. Garbo's father was liberal and secular, while his mother was strict and religious. These differences in his parents' beliefs had a profound impact on Garbo's character, nurturing an independent and adaptable spirit in him. At the age of 7, Garbo went to a boarding school. This school had strict conditions. Garbo was only allowed to leave on Sundays. At this school, Garbo learned how to cope with loneliness and challenges. His father visited him every week, but being away from his family strengthened his independence. He stayed at this school until 1923, which means he was there for 4 years. At the age of 13, Garbo was transferred to a school in Barcelona that was run by his father's friend. But at 16, after an argument with a teacher, he dropped out of school and started working as an apprentice in a hardware store. His father's death in 1931 was a turning point in his life. At the age of 19, Garbo witnessed the confiscation of his family's factory during the Spanish Civil War. This very event deepened his hatred of war and political extremism. He tried his hand at various jobs, from studying animal husbandry to managing a cinema. And all these experiences enhanced his social skills and adaptability. The Spanish Civil War had a profound impact on Garbo. He was initially forced to serve in the Republican Army, but because he despised both sides, both the Republicans and the fascists, he eventually deserted the army and went into hiding for a while. Repeated arrests by Franco's forces greatly strengthened his resolve to fight against fascism in World War II. After the start of World War II, Garbo, who hated fascism and Nazism, became determined to help the Allies. He offered to cooperate with the British 3 times. In 1941, he went to the British Embassy in Madrid but was rejected. That same year, he contacted MI6 through a friend, but once again, he was not taken seriously. Sometime later, he wrote directly to the MI6 office in London, but the British assumed he was a Nazi infiltrator and rejected him. Garbo did not give up. He decided that if the Allies didn't want him, he would deceive the Nazis. In July 1941, Garbo contacted the German intelligence service, the Abwehr, in Madrid, and introduced himself as a devoted Nazi. He claimed that he could spy for the Germans in Britain, but in reality, he never went to Britain. From Lisbon, Portugal, Garbo fabricated fake reports for the Germans using British guidebooks and newspapers. Maybe as we're telling this story now, it doesn't seem like anything particularly special to you. Okay, so someone is sending a bunch of fake reports, and on the other side, the Germans are reading them and getting fooled. But the thing is, the story isn't that simple. First of all, on the German side, there were plenty of skilled analysts who would sit and analyze all the reports. It's not just one or two people. Several teams are doing this work, and these reports keep moving up the chain of command, reaching higher levels. And if these reports contain mistakes or aren't properly filtered as they should be, they'll definitely get exposed, and that spy will either be burned or completely sidelined. So while these reports had to be accurate, Garbo would also pull some tricks to mess with the German analysts, test their reactions, and uncover the flaws in their system. Why did he do this? Obviously, if you want to infiltrate or damage a system, the first thing you need to do is find its bugs. You need to figure out where the system makes mistakes, where it can't verify the truth, and where it can be deceived. And by gathering this information on the appointed day, or whenever you feel it's time to deliver the final blow, you can design a special operation. Garbo deliberately included strange mistakes in his reports to test the Germans' attention to detail. For example, he claimed that Scottish workers protested at the ports because of a shortage of 1 liter of wine. This is a laughable mistake for any Briton because Scots are fond of whiskey and beer, not wine. But the Germans, who had little knowledge of British culture, overlooked this mistake or perhaps didn't even notice it and even gave him money and equipment. Why didn't the Germans notice this mistake? Because the German intelligence service, the Abwehr, had limited resources in Britain and their knowledge of the country's culture and geography was minimal. The German analysts, who were under the pressure of war, accepted Garbo's reports without thorough examination. Because he had gained the Germans' trust with his detailed and regular reports, and Garbo had two purposes for making these deliberate mistakes. His first goal was to test the Germans' trust. When the Germans didn't become suspicious of his reports, he realized that later on he could use even bigger deceptions in his reports and understood that the Germans trusted him to a great extent. His second goal was to build a persona. Garbo's aim was to show that he was an eager but amateur spy. In other words, an amateur spy shouldn't have all of his information be correct. Sometimes he needed to make childish mistakes so that the intelligence service receiving his reports would conclude that yes, he's an amateur and couldn't possibly be a professional spy hired by the opposing intelligence service. Garbo played this role perfectly and the Germans truly fell for it. Up to this point, we've understood that Garbo is spying for the Germans. But what is his goal? His goal is to bring some benefit or advantage to Britain. Why? Because Garbo hates fascists and doesn't want the Germans to win the war. But up until now, he had been working for the Germans. He needed to join Britain's MI5 intelligence service so he could coordinate with them and harm the Germans in line with their policies. But he couldn't manage to do this himself. This is where his wife's role becomes crucial in the story. In February 1942, Garbo's wife, Mrs. Araceli Gonzalez, bravely and cleverly takes action. She goes to the American embassy in Madrid and meets with an American diplomat. Araceli explains that Garbo is spying for the Germans, but he's doing it as a deception and his real goal is to serve the Allies. She presents samples of Garbo's fake reports and, with confidence and charisma, emphasizes their shared hatred of the fascists. These clever negotiations led the American diplomat to pass the information on to MI6. Araceli, acting as an intermediary, facilitated the initial negotiations, and eventually, in April 1942, the British accepted Garbo. He was transferred to London and began working under the supervision of MI5. Araceli, Garbo's wife, also accompanied him and became his inseparable partner in crafting fake messages and managing the stresses of espionage. In 1944, the Allies intended to surprise the Germans with Operation Overlord during the Normandy invasion, but Hitler had stationed a massive force, including panzer armored divisions, on the French coast. Garbo played a vital role in Operation Fortitude, the greatest deception in the history of war, to mislead the Germans. One of the masterpieces of Garbo and MI5 was the creation of an imaginary spy network. That is, in order for Garbo to show that he was an important figure in Britain and that the information he was sending to the Germans was accurate and reliable, he had created a spy network with various people in different positions, and for each of these fictional characters, he had developed a backstory. It wasn't just that he introduced a single person. Let me say that a woman named X, who is the secretary of the Ministry of War, gave me this confidential information. He would introduce this person. He would create a character for her. He would invent a series of problems for her, and in exchange for those problems, she would do certain things. For example, he would say this woman is divorced from her husband and has no money. In exchange for money, she gives me this information. Or for instance, he would say another person is a Belgian nationalist, and because of the issues he has with Britain, he's willing to provide Garbo with some confidential information about the movements of British ships. Each of these character creations and storytelling efforts made the Germans completely believe what he said and trust him 100%. Garbo would send more than 400 encrypted messages, each with different writing styles, to these spies. He would create personal stories, relationships, and structural problems for each spy to make the report seem more realistic. The Germans, who had limited resources to verify the information, were completely deceived and assumed this network was real. This trust became the foundation for a much bigger deception. Garbo, using encrypted messages, convinced the Germans that the attack on Normandy was just a diversion. The main assault, he claimed, was going to take place at Pas-de-Calais, which is the closest point to Britain. Garbo spoke of a fictitious force called the British Fourth Army in Scotland, supposedly preparing to attack Norway, and the Germans believed this story as well. Garbo made use of geographical locations. Pas-de-Calais was the shortest route for an attack on Europe, and the Germans considered it the Allies' main target. He sent reports about imaginary troop movements, ships, and equipment in southeastern England, which were coordinated with Operation Fortitude South. The claim of an attack on Norway also caused German forces to be dispersed across Scandinavia. This information led Hitler to keep his key armored divisions, such as the 15th Panzer Division, in Pas-de-Calais, which allowed the Allies to capture Normandy with less resistance. On June 6, 1944, Garbo sent a warning about the Normandy attack to the Germans, but he deliberately sent this message with a delay of about 3 hours before the attack, at a time when it was already too late for the Germans to react. In cooperation with MI5, he timed the message so that it would get caught up in a slow process of decryption and analysis. The Allied attacks on German communication infrastructure also made it difficult for the message to be received. When the Germans finally received the message with a delay, Garbo blamed them for their slowness and said, "I am doing this for my ideals and my faith, otherwise I would have given up this work. I have to explain this part a bit more. The process of decrypting a spy message takes a certain amount of time. The next point is that Garbo deliberately sent this message in the middle of the night because he knew that the German operator who was supposed to decrypt the message wouldn't be at work at that time, and by the time he got to the message, it would be too late. Because not only did he receive the message late, but it also takes some time to decrypt the message and pass it on to his superiors. That's why Garbo cleverly made this message both longer and sent it later, but in such a way that he could later claim, "I informed you earlier, but you weren't able to decrypt the message in time, and that was the reason for your failure. Otherwise, I had already warned you about where the British were planning to attack from, and you failed to prevent it." In other words, instead of being embarrassed for providing false information, he was actually acting entitled, saying, "I gave you the information, and you didn't receive it properly." This person was truly very clever. Garbo's bold tactic not only maintained the Germans' trust, but even made them apologize to him. Even after the Normandy operation, Garbo managed to convince the Germans that this operation was a deception and that the main attack was still going to take place at Pas-de-Calais. This caused German forces to remain in the wrong locations until late June 1944. Through years of consistent reporting, Garbo had gained the complete trust of the Germans, and he operated under the supervision of the British Double Cross Committee, with every message he sent being coordinated with Allied strategy. Abwehr's weaknesses, such as a lack of resources to verify information, also contributed to Garbo's success. This deception gave the Allies the opportunity to secure Normandy and paved the way for the liberation of Europe. Garbo received medals from both sides for his unparalleled deception. Garbo was one of the few people to be awarded medals for bravery by both sides of the war. I think there are fewer than you can count on one hand, which is why this man is truly exceptional. But the end of the war did not mean the end of danger for Garbo. He feared revenge from the remaining Nazis who had taken refuge in Spain and South America. The Franco regime in Spain, which had close ties to the Nazis, could also pose a threat to him. In 1949, with the help of MI5, Garbo faked his own death to stay safe from Nazi revenge. He and MI5 spread a rumor that Garbo had died of malaria in Angola, which was then a Portuguese colony. This story was carefully crafted. First of all, malaria deaths in Angola were common, so if you told someone that a person had died of malaria there, it wouldn't surprise them. Moreover, records of such information in Angola were much less thorough. We know that it's an underdeveloped African country and doesn't have much of a bureaucracy. That's why some documents might get lost or might not even be recorded at all, and no one can really follow up on such an incident. MI5 also placed forged documents such as a death certificate, burial permit, and similar information through certain intermediaries in channels where Nazi spies could find them and confirm Garbo's death. In this way, Garbo and his family could be sure that no one would come after them anymore, and the character of Garbo would be forever dead in the minds of the Nazis. Garbo cut off all ties with his past. Even his close ones, including some family members, all believed that he was dead. He fled to Venezuela with a new identity, using an alias and forged documents. At that time, the country was a haven for European immigrants and some fugitive Nazis. In Venezuela, Garbo started a simple life, opened a small bookstore, and avoided any public activity that might reveal his identity. The rumor of his death was so believable that the remaining Nazis or former Abwehr agents made no effort to find him. After the war, the Nazi spy networks had also collapsed and their resources for tracking double agents were limited. Garbo's cautious behavior and the professional support of MI5 completed this deception. Garbo continued to live under this false identity until 1984, until a British journalist named Nigel West, who was researching double agents, found information about him. He investigated further and realized that Garbo was probably not dead, and even went to Venezuela and found this man. Garbo, realizing that this journalist had come on behalf of MI5, shared his information with him and was eventually convinced to publish his memoirs. With the publication of this information in Britain, the people of the country considered him a hero and invited him to return to Britain. For the first time since World War II, he was able to see the results of his actions. That is, the liberation of Britain and the defeat of the Germans. Mr. Garbo passed away on October 10, 1988 at the age of 76 in Venezuela, but his story endured in history as the master of deception. Garbo proved that sometimes, with a creative story, you can save millions of lives and change the fate of nations. Garbo showed that in the world of espionage, the line between truth and lies is very thin. His story was a blend of intelligence, courage, and genius that still inspires many people today.